Hi, good afternoon. This is Lori Smetanka, the Executive Director of Consumer Voice. Folks are loading into the webinar right now, so I'm just going to give it 1 minute while that happens so that people can get connected, and then we'll get started. Okay, hi, good afternoon. Again, this is Lori Smetanka. I'm the Executive Director of the Consumer Voice, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Sexual Abuse in Nursing Homes, What You Need to Know. Alicia, can you move to the next slide, please? I know we have folks that are still logging in. We've got a very full agenda for today, so we're going to get started with moving along. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with our organization, but we here at the Consumer Voice advocate with and for individuals who are receiving long-term care and services, including in nursing homes and assisted living and other settings. We offer information, resources, and technical assistance to state and local advocates, residents and family members, and others who are seeking to promote quality and to protect rights in long-term care. So why are we doing this webinar today? Well, last year you may remember that CNN released an expose on this topic of sexual assault in nursing homes. And that investigative report, which was called Sick, Dying, and Raped in America's Nursing Homes, was really a horrific reminder that despite progress and efforts to prevent abuse and federal and state laws that have been passed intended to offer protections to residents, these abuses are still occurring in long-term care facilities. And so that CNN report caused several of us, including our friends at the National Center on Elder Abuse, with whom we're co-producing this webinar today, to determine that we really needed to increase our efforts in this area in terms of raising awareness, providing resources, and offering trainings that would, we hope, prevent some future assaults, as well as increase the likelihood that residents who have been assaulted will receive the supports, investigations, and justice that they deserve. So considering the fact that more than 1,500 people signed up for this webinar today, we think we're on the right track in focusing our attention on this issue. Next slide, please, Alicia. So today we've prepared a very full program for you that will include Dr. Pamela Teester, who's a professor at Virginia Tech Center for Gerontology. Her expertise includes elder and vulnerable adult mistreatment, public and private guardianship, end-of-life issues, and more, and she will share research findings and implications of sexual abuse in long-term care settings. We also will hear from Alicia Lineswala, who's a public policy and program specialist here at Consumer Voice, who will give an overview of current federal rules around abuse prevention and protection. Amity Overall-Labe, who's the director of the National Ombudsman Resource Center, will discuss the role of the Ombudsman in investigating complaints involving abuse. And Vicki Elting, who is the Assistant State Ombudsman in Washington, will talk about a program that they have initiated in their state to combat sexual violence in long-term care. Next slide, please, Alicia. I want to share up front that today's webinar will not be covering the issues related to resident capacity to consent to sexual activity. We know that that is a very important topic, and that's really an entire program in itself and one that we'll cover in a future webinar. So today we are focusing on actual abuse, assuming that there has been no consent. And a few housekeeping items. As you heard at the beginning, this webinar is being recorded. The recording and materials will be posted to the Consumer Voice website for future download. The PowerPoint and a new issue brief that we're releasing today on this topic can be downloaded from your control panel. All of your lines are going to be muted. And if we have time at the end of the program, we will take questions and respond to the questions. And you can type those in the control panel box labeled as questions on your computer screen. So with that, I'd like to introduce Julie Shane, who's the Deputy Director of the National Center on Elder Abuse, with whom, as I said, we've collaborated on this webinar and the issue brief released today. Julie?
Thank you so much, Lori. It's my honor to be here and working on this webinar with these esteemed speakers. And when Lori told me last week that we had 1,500 people registered, I just had to take a moment and consider that we need to think about two things. One is that as the National Center on Elder Abuse, we really do need to focus on this topic and make sure that we are addressing it, and not only addressing it, but number two, working with all of you to provide solutions. Because with this many people interested in the topic and this many people who are observing and seeing things that are happening and maybe have had some successes, that we can work together and we can find solutions. Now, some of you may not know about the National Center on Elder Abuse, so I've been just given this minute to tell you about it so that you can utilize the resources that we have, as we are one of the 27 national resource centers that are funded by the Administration on Community Living. And so we're here for you. We have a very robust listserv. If you are not a member and would like to join, there'll be contact information at the end of the presentation so that you can sign up for our listserv. We have a technical assistance line and a email service that we can respond to inquiries and provide the resources people need. And we do have a lot of valuable educational resources that you can co-brand and take and utilize. You don't have to reinvent these resources. We do provide training curricula. We have a whole website devoted to elder abuse training materials. And we do put together our research briefs on the most up-to-date research. But what we really love to do is build our partnerships and make connections. Consumer Voice has just been a pleasure to work with because we see their passion and their dedication, along with so many others in so many other areas of elder abuse. And we're looking at those innovative models, when we're listening to what the field needs and to what consumers need, and we're going to take advantage of those opportunities to advance the field and communicate our efforts. But not only will we envision our goals for tomorrow, but we will look toward what we can do in the future with your help to end abuse. And so now I'll turn it back to you, Alicia, so we can all learn.
Great, thanks. Next slide, Alicia, please. And this is Lori, and we will look forward to now turning the program over to Pam, Dr. Pam Teester from the Center for Gerontology at Virginia Tech University. Pam?
Yes, thank you very much, Julie, Lori, Alicia, and I really appreciate it. I have been privileged to do some work on this topic, and so we'll present you some of the findings today. Those of you that were just at NAPSA will know that we did a lot of this work with Adult Protective Services, and so I just want to let you know that's where our data have come from. And I often tell Lori that I'm looking for every opportunity in the world to be able to work with the Ombudsman program, having been one a long time ago. So the picture that you see is just, believe it or not, right below where my office is. It's not quite those colors yet, but it will be. So if you feel enticed to come to Virginia sometime, that's what you can look forward to, just to give you a flavor from where I am. I think that's sort of important. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I just wanted to be sure that I discuss with you. I think a slide jumped or something. Should be on the. Can you go back? Okay, perfect. Okay, so just before we started, I wanted to just share this definition the CDC has about elder sexual abuse. That is not just rape, but unwanted touching where consent is not given, and also if they're committed against an incapacitated person not competent to give informed approval. I know that's a whole set of issues, and I know Lori said you'd have another lively webinar on that. I certainly have had a lot of questions about that related to guardianship and et cetera. So I will leave that for another day, but just to say there's the definition of the CDC work, a lot of that going to a really fine panel, and particularly a shout out to Jeff Hall, with whom I have worked and published a book just recently. Okay, next slide, please. So just really quickly, I wanted to give you the literature review in this country, and this sort of tell you the goods and the bads of it. So unfortunately, we're sort of in there a good deal. So I will be talking a little bit about myself, but I did want to just cite that Ronna Cherno could give you some global, Ron's work we all refer to all the time, has really began to do this work, only it was in the community setting and for capacitated people because of the research design. So over 5,700 respondents, but a 1-year prevalence for 4.6% for emotional abuse, 1.6% for physical abuse, 0.6% for sexual abuse, 5.1 for potential neglect, and 5.2 for financial abuse, that being the highest one. And I just kind of want to point out the sex abuse numbers in any study I've ever been in, anything, with the exception of maybe one long ago study by Brian Payne, now also in Virginia, have been fairly low, excepting we believe always that's an undercount, although I don't have anything to go on with that. But again, that's the community setting. So I just want to point that out. Then we did 2 studies, actually. One was in Virginia, and that's the one that you see, sexual abuse of older women living in nursing homes. This was a 5-year study we did here where I am. Files from APS with 50 cases that we had of this. Most common sexual abuse involved in nursing homes was sexualized kissing and fondling and unwelcome sexual interest in a woman's body. For that particular study, all the perpetrators were male, 70 years of age and older, and most were residents in nursing homes. And so only in 3 cases, this will be a song I'll sing, only in 3 cases was the alleged offender prosecuted in court, and only 1 was the offender convicted. So that was that early study, actually done prior to, we were finishing up the publication of this as we were moving along to the other study. Then we began to look at older women living in nursing homes, this study with another set of fine colleagues, particularly as you'll recognize, I think, Holly Ramsey-Klosnick. And there we found 26 cases of older men. And this was sort of groundbreaking because heretofore it had been sort of seen as an older woman's sort of an issue of older women in facilities. And these, we dropped the age, the older men were 50 and older, cases in 5 states, and you'll see a little bit more about that study. 6 were confirmed upon investigation. Again, APS is where we got our data. Victims were mostly white males with cognitive and physical deficits. Residents substantiated more often than staff. And I'm going to sing that song a little bit too. So let's press on our merry way, and then I'll go on of some more things. All right. So how could I possibly not acknowledge these folks? So Holly Ramsey-Klosnick, with whom I am privileged to get to be doing another study now on surrogate decision maker perpetrators that we're just starting, that launches out actually next week. Our funding date starts from the Retirement Research Foundation. Aaron Abner was a student when we first did this work, now an associate professor at the University of Kentucky. APS in those 5 states, you see Oregon, New Hampshire, Tennessee, Texas, and Wisconsin, and in other agencies, because we did the whole state in Texas and Wisconsin Elder Abuse and Wisconsin Bureau of Quality Assurance. So those were the sources that we had of data. Next slide, please. Because we wanted to try to understand the nature of sexual abuse and the particular grant that we had, which was funded by the National Institute on Aging, we wanted to look at patterns of, it was about people living in long-term care institutions, and so it covered the gamut, or that's how we played it. And believe it or not, we were testing a web-based system for getting sensitive data at the time, and then we wanted to create some kind of, we were even then trying to look at an emergent theory for the mistreatment of vulnerable adults, something the field has moved forward with in the past 10 years. Next slide, please. We wanted to know, as you probably do, who were the victims, the offenders, where were they happening, what were correlative factors, what were the investigation process like, and what do we do for them, for both victims and perpetrators? I don't think we're still answering these questions and trying to do a better job of them. And so that was the perfect piece that we were doing, but it was originally a 3-year NIA study. And what was kind of groundbreaking at the time was we were collecting data prospectively. We learned from the other study, we don't collect it retrospectively. We want to be on everybody's radar, and then we would start. So we literally collected from May to October, and then we conducted file reviews as well as telephone interviews. So that was what that study design was. Next slide, please. There's the states that you can just see them all over the map. These were wonderful people who agreed to be in our study, and we were so proud of that. That we got what looked like a geographic dispersion, like we planned it. But the truth of the matter was, these were people who said yes, and we had to have adult protective services. You ombudsmen know you always are working in facilities, but that's not true for adult protective services. So what limited the states that really could participate with us, we didn't want to do a reboot of Virginia because we've just done it. So what we were looking for here was the states that could investigate in facilities, and a broad swath of that, and were willing to do the work and collect for 6 months, which is pretty huge. So that is what we tried to have in our particular study. Next slide, please. Whoever's doing the slide, you're doing a great job. So we wanted to figure out factors associated with the substantiation of sex abuse cases, and we looked at when we begin to look at these data now for care facilities, we also wanted to look to see what were unadjusted analysis and adjusted analysis, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit, real quickly. Okay, next slide, please, because I'm on the clock. So in sheer numbers, victims in substantiated cases, and I don't think I need to say for any of the people on this call, 1,500 of you, that some cases are the ones that APS believes they have enough information to say that the abuse probably happened, and that is different by state, by the way. But having said that, when the results were not adjusted statistically, we found that victims were about 10 years older than cases that were not sub, because we were looking at alleged versus sub. More likely to be female, have dementia. I'm confident this is no big surprise to those of you that deal with these cases. More likely to have impaired ADLs, less likely to be oriented to person, and less likely to reside in care facilities with high-level supervision. And I want to explain that, so go to the next slide, please. We looked at places all over. We looked at all kinds of levels of care settings, and the states had these as their responsibility. So where we placed nursing homes or SNFs was in the moderate level, and we placed state schools, however you want to see this. This is how we decided as a group to do this. So state schools and acute care hospitals, it was like the care and supervision. So if you think about the results of that, where we had skilled nursing facilities and where we had assisted living, were in moderate levels of supervision. So I just want to point that out to you, because that's why the findings are as you have them, and you may wonder about that. Okay, next slide, please. I'm flipping my pages. All right, so unadjusted results. When the results were not adjusted statistically by regression and odds ratios, we did not see differences with orientation to place or time or ability to communicate when we were trying to look at alleged versus substantiated. Next slide. Again, on average, sexual abuse allegations were, and this begins to start to tell a pretty interesting story. On average, sexual abuse allegations were more likely to be substantiated if there was an allegation of neglect, so something, an addition, or it was of a hands-on type. And so you can see how Holly has some really nice and elegant work on hands-off, hands-on, hands-off types of sexual abuse. So you can begin to see what we would regard in some ways as the, as the things that we, everybody would think about sexual abuse in this way, but not everybody thinks of fondling and kissing unwanted as sexual abuse. I, in fact, do. But I've had some rather interesting arguments with people who see that differently. So just point that out. And then if the accused perpetrator was another resident, that was substantiated more often, and you'll see that bear out in some more of the research analysis. So go forward, please. Thank you. Okay, and so and on average, again, for about the investigation, if the victim disclosed, it was usually substantiated more, but we got a little caveat on that. There was regulatory authority for the investigative agency, and the time was critical. So when the incident in the report was less than 4 days, it was more likely. We did not see differences about victims making an allegation or now, we did a different model to look at it differently, so we adjusted statistically for some different categories. So unadjusted ignores differences between age, gender, ethnicity, health status, COG status, and socioeconomic status. To adjust our findings, our model, we held things constant so that we could begin to have a deeper dive into analysis about what we were finding. And so for our particular study, then we adjusted our findings on a model where we held constant victim, allegation, and investigation, and then tried to look at odds ratios to see what the likelihood of these things were occurring, holding some things constant. So it's a better analysis than just raw numbers. So our adjusted model just looked at these predictors that you see, and then we held these things constant and then tried to run our model again to see what fell out. So next slide, please. Okay, so now we began to tell a tale. We began to look to see what our model is predicting about the perpetrator, and you can begin to see where the odds ratios play in. This means the likelihood it did or did not occur. Don't be too crazy statistically just to say. So we began to start seeing main effects now with the adjusted piece. The resident is a perpetrator, the level of care facility, the victim disclosed abuse, and the victim was injured begins to fall out for things that are substantiated. The rest of the pieces didn't. Next slide. So here becomes the important pieces. The one that fell out the most important was time from incident to report, less than 3 days, and the victim disclosed abuse. So you begin to see of those kinds of ways to adjust for the study, what begins to fall out now is terribly important for things to be substantiated. Next slide. So based on this, then the key factors that predicted substantiation were care facility level of supervision, perpetrator relationship to victim, that there was an injury, that the victim disclosed, and back to time from incident to report. Next slide. As researchers, we must constantly be honest with what our data can and cannot do. So we studied 5 states. It might not be true for 5 other states, but there are 5 states and a data set of over 400 cases that began to sort of collected over a 6-month period where we began to sort of see that. We did not measure past experience of the investigator, although we sort of tried to get that in another way. Nor the victim's cognitive status. We didn't test the victim's cognitive status. That was reported by APS. So we didn't look at that because we didn't have a measure of it that we used for this study. Next slide. So here begins another tale. A long ago study that I did with APS found that APS investigated when we combined all allegations together, they tended to substantiate about half the time. But when it was facility sexual abuse investigations, that got much lower. And so here were questions that we thought about. You all can think about this as we get through the presentation. How much of this is different to facility cases? Because the numbers are quite different. How much is due to a sexual abuse allegation? Are they somehow less often substantiated? Are they harder to investigate and harder to substantiate? And we asked this of the people who were doing the investigations, and most said they were, some said they weren't. So it's interesting. So I don't have much to tell you about that, except that's what we found of the interviews that we did. Okay, next slide. Not surprising, more females than male victims in substantiated cases, because there simply are more females than males. That alleged physical contact is substantiated more than none. But then this raises some questions. How do we consider non-touching forms of sex abuse? And do state and regulation definitions include non-touching sexual events? It's because that of course would affect some of the activities that go. Significant. Over half of alleged perpetrators were facility employees and a fourth were residents. That's what we found when they were allegations. However, over half of substantiated cases involved resident alleged perpetrators. We think that's news. Staff alleged perpetrator sub rate was about 20%. Resident was 2.5 times that. Next slide. We went from significant to profound. So substantiation was more likely when the abuse report was received within 3 days of the alleged incident. Really important. A 4-fold greater odds of substantiation. And if you hear something in the background, I think it's somebody knowing that I've got every window closed in my office. So implications are mandatory reporting time and time limits, and when investigations commence become very critical here with this profound finding. Next slide. If the alleged victim disclosed abuse, they were substantiated at a 3-fold higher rate. But among women, over a fourth who disclosed didn't have their case substantiated. So here's an implication. People who are disclosing may not be believed. What would a nonverbal victim have as a chance to have a case substantiated, and a real need for special communication remedies because of that issue. Next slide. If there were injuries, there was a 5-fold greater odds of substantiation. But believe it or not, very few victims received forensic exams, and some never even looked at their bodies. Next case. Next slide. So now I will move to signs and symptoms and indicators of sexual abuse. I took this from a website I saw, so I'm pretty confident you know these, but anyway, here are potential signs and indicators of sexual abuse. Some. Next slide. More having to do with people's signs of agitation or fear, understandably. Appropriate actions that seem to occur. Suicide attempts, and you can see the site that I got this from. Next slide. Response to the victim. I think the key is listen to him or her and believe and have a high index of suspicion. Act quickly. We saw interventions sometimes for these cases where you felt like the person that got the most punishment was the victim, not the perpetrator. And we are now working on a paper on polyvictimization. We hadn't even developed the definition, not that it didn't occur, but we hadn't developed a definition for it when we did this study. So we're, believe it or not, using the same data set, and that will be a paper that we hope will be forthcoming in the next year. And then the responses we know now have to be all over the place: the perpetrator, the family, and the affected organization, and more. Next slide. Thank you. I'm going to conclude because I had a lot to pack in 15 minutes, and I think I got it about that way. So anyway, thank you very much, and I'll go on to the next presenter.
Thanks, Pam. So my name's Alicia, and as Lori mentioned, I work as the Public Policy and Program Specialist at Consumer Voice. I will be discussing the protections of the federal nursing home regulations that provide against sexual abuse for residents. So first, the federal nursing home regulations define sexual abuse as non-consensual contact of any type with a resident. An important component of the regulations is that all residents have the right to be free from abuse, including sexual abuse. The guidelines specifically state that each resident has the right to be free from abuse of any type from anyone. So we know that sexual abuse can take on many forms, including unwanted intimate touching, rape, or taking sexually explicit photographs or audio or video recording of a resident and distributing them online. And as we heard from Dr. Teeser's presentations, perpetrators can be a variety of people: permanent or temporary facility staff, family, friends, strangers, or even other residents. To help ensure that residents are and remain free from sexual abuse, facilities are responsible for taking steps that will prevent and protect residents from abuse. That includes implementing policies, practices, and training for staff. They are required to monitor any behaviors that may provoke a reaction by residents or others, which includes sexually aggressive behaviors. If facility staff observe resident altercations, staff are required to provide immediate care planning interventions to address a resident's sexual aggression and ensure the safety of all residents. Furthermore, facilities are required to develop and implement procedures related to visitor access. These include safety restrictions such as denying access or providing limited or supervised access to a visitor who has been found to be sexually abusing residents or is suspected of abusing a resident until the investigation of the allegation is complete. To move on and protect residents from sexual abuse, facilities have a responsibility to screen who they hire as staff. Specifically, the federal nursing home regulations require that facilities must not employ or otherwise engage individuals who have been found guilty of abuse by a court of law, have had a finding entered into the state nurse aid registry concerning abuse, or have a disciplinary action in effect against his or her professional license by a state licensure body as a result of a finding of abuse. And as you can see, facilities are also required to report any knowledge that they have about actions of a court of law against an employee to the state nurse aid registry or licensing authorities that indicate unfitness for service as a nurse aid or facility staff. So in short, facilities must be thorough in their investigations of the histories of prospective staff. The guidelines state that facilities should have developed and implemented policies and procedures related to screening prior to employment. In addition to posting inquiries at the state nurse aid registry and licensing authorities, facilities should check information from previous and/or current employers and make reasonable efforts to uncover information about any past criminal prosecution. Facilities have several requirements relating to written policies and procedures that they must develop and implement to protect residents from sexual abuse. First and foremost, facilities are required to develop and implement written policies and procedures that prohibit and prevent sexual abuse of residents. In addition, these policies and procedures must include training of staff on what constitutes abuse and the procedures for reporting incidents or allegations. In addition, the regulations go on to require facilities to develop and implement written policies and procedures outlining investigation protocol for allegations of abuse. And finally, facilities must develop and implement written policies and procedures that ensure reporting of crimes, including sexual abuse. To ensure reporting, these policies and procedures must include, at a minimum, annually notifying covered individuals of their obligation to comply with the requirement to report abuse immediately, but not later than 2 hours after forming the suspicion of abuse to the state agency and one or more law enforcement entities, posting a conspicuous notice of employee rights, and prohibiting and preventing retaliation. So covered individuals include anyone who is an owner, operator, employee, manager, agent, or contractor of the facility. All of these people have an obligation to comply with the requirements. And finally, we've covered residents' rights to be free from abuse and the facility requirements relating to screening and written policies and procedures. But what happens if there's actually an allegation of abuse? The federal regulations and guidelines outline clear and appropriate responses to these allegations. If an allegation of abuse has been reported, the facility has a responsibility to protect the victim or victims involved. They must report the alleged violations to the administrator and appropriate state and local authorities. They must also begin an investigation of the allegation. Facilities are required to start this response process immediately. The guidelines state that immediately means as soon as possible in the absence of a shorter state timeframe requirement, but not later than 2 hours after the allegation is made. In cases of sexual abuse, the facility must immediately put effective measures in place to ensure that further potential abuse does not occur while the investigation is in process. Facilities should monitor the victim and other residents at risk and evaluate whether the victim feels safe, and if she does not feel safe, take immediate steps to alleviate the fear, such as a room relocation or increased supervision. Facilities should also conduct an immediate assessment of the victim and provide medical treatment as necessary. They must immediately notify the victim's doctor, family, or other responsible party of the abuse. They also must remove access by the perpetrator to the victim and ensure that ongoing safety and protection is provided to the victim and, as appropriate, to other residents. Finally, administrative staff, including the administrator, should be informed and involved throughout the investigation. So now that we know facilities must immediately start an investigation, what are they required to do during that? Well, facilities are required to provide evidence, including full documentation that all alleged violations have been thoroughly investigated. And as mentioned earlier, they must prevent further potential abuse while the investigation is in process. Finally, the facility must report the results of the investigation to the administrator and to other officials in accordance with state laws within 5 working days of the incident. This includes reporting to the state survey agency. If the violation is verified, appropriate corrective action must be taken to protect the residents. So in short, you can see that the federal nursing home regulations provide many protections to residents in terms of facilities, in providing and preventing abuse, as well as setting standards for clear and appropriate responses. With that, I'll pass it on to Amity, who's director of the National Ombudsman Resource Center, to discuss the role and responsibilities of the Ombudsman program in investigating complaints and involving abuse.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Alicia. So I'm going to take the next very few minutes to give a very brief overview of the role of the Ombudsman program in investigating complaints, of course, including abuse. First, what's NORC, the National Ombudsman Resource Center? We're funded by the Administration for Community Living and operated by Consumer Voice, and we provide support and technical assistance to ombudsman programs across the country. Next slide. What is the Ombudsman program for those of you that may not be that familiar with it? First and foremost, the Ombudsman program advocates for the quality of life and care of residents in nursing homes, board and care, assisted living, and other similar adult homes. According to the Older Americans Act and the Ombudsman regulations, responsibilities of the program include identifying, investigating, and resolving complaints made by or on behalf of residents, educating consumers about resident rights, good care practices, and other related topics, providing information to the public regarding long-term care facilities and services, as well as resident rights and legislative and policy issues, educating providers about resident rights, good care practices, preventing abuse, and a variety of other topics, helping develop and support resident and family councils, and advocating for improvements in the entire long-term care system, which we refer to as systems advocacy. Next slide, please. Before taking a closer look at complaint processing, I wanted to provide a snapshot of major Ombudsman program activities per the 2016 National Ombudsman Reporting System, otherwise known as NORS data. To give you just an idea of a lot of the work that they do, they visited 27,000 long-term care facilities at least quarterly, attended over 22,000 resident council meetings and nearly 2,000 family council meetings, provided over 10,000 community education sessions, and over 300,000 moments of providing information and consultation to an individual, which means residents, family members, and others about information about long-term care services, resident rights, and so on. And they also provided over 115,000 consultations to facility staff. So as you can see, they do a variety of important things in the field. As I'll explain in the next few slides, since the Ombudsman program is not the primary investigator of abuse, the program does not receive all complaints about abuse. So NORS, the National Ombudsman Reporting System data, just shows the number of complaints regarding abuse that the program receives and does not really give the full picture of abuse in nursing homes and other facilities. But to give you an idea, in 2016, the Ombudsman program investigated nearly 200,000 complaints. That's in nursing homes, assisted living, board and care, and other similar facilities. Over 11,000 of those, the nursing home complaints, involved abuse, gross neglect, or exploitation. 819 of those complaints involved sexual harassment, sexual coercion, or sexual assault by facility staff, management, or an outside person that gained access to the resident due to negligence on the facility staff. And over 2,000 complaints involved willful physical or sexual abuse by a resident to another resident, which supports the research findings that was mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So generally speaking, Ombudsman program representatives, they investigate individual complaints and address concerns that impact several residents in a facility, all residents in a facility, or multiple facilities, or the entire long-term care system in their state, or even looking at national issues. They can address general concerns that they observe personally, such as odors in the facility, concerns about the environment, observing that staff are not knocking on resident doors. They cannot share information without resident consent. They investigate to gather facts, but the main goal is to resolve the issue to the resident's satisfaction. And importantly, they call upon others to fulfill their responsibilities for residents. For example, Ombudsman program representatives do not provide direct care. Rather, they advocate that the resident receives the direct care that they're entitled to by the facility staff where they reside. And again, representatives represent residents' needs by working for legislative and regulatory changes. Next slide. The primary responsibility of the Ombudsman program is to serve as resident advocates. Program representatives support resident-centered care, and residents guide all action. So that means that they get consent initially upon receiving a complaint, and then they follow up and keep the resident as involved in the process as possible. Next slide. The Ombudsman rule, effective in July 2016, reinforced the requirements of the Older Americans Act and added more detail regarding complaint investigations. The rule provided clarity in that Ombudsman program advocacy is person-centered in order to ensure consent and maximize resident participation throughout the process. It also clarified that the program's responsibility in abuse complaints is to act as an advocate and a problem solver for the abuse survivor, not to substantiate the allegation, meaning not to prove whether the suspected abuse occurred or not. Due to time limitations, I'm not going to go into detail of the rule, but I wanted to emphasize the person-centered complaint process approach in the rule. There's a link at the end of my slides to our webpage for more information about the rule if you're interested. As you can see laid out on this slide, the Ombudsman program representative needs to support and maximize resident participation, offer privacy, meet with the resident privately, and make sure to keep their information confidential until they receive consent to disclose it. They need to discuss the complaint with the resident. For example, the Ombudsman program often gets complaints from family members or others, then they still need to check with the resident and see the resident's perspective on that complaint and if they want the Ombudsman program to even be involved. Request informed consent, determine the wishes of the resident with respect to the resolution of the complaint. For example, if it's something that could be referred to the state survey agency, then the Ombudsman program representative needs to get the resident's consent to do so, or another agency, such as APS. Advise the resident of his or her rights, work with the resident to develop a plan of action for resolution, investigate to determine whether the complaint can be verified, and determine whether the complaint is resolved to the resident's satisfaction. So as you can see, there are several times in that process where the Ombudsman program is seeking resident guidance for next steps, ensuring consent, and keeping them involved in the process, which is as it should be. Next slide. So why is resident-directed advocacy important? Through the strict disclosure limitations within the Act and the rule, it's very clear that the Ombudsman program is intended to be a safe, person-centered place for residents to bring their concerns. Providing confidential, conflict-free, resident-directed advocacy puts the program in a trusted position and allows program representatives to build rapport with residents and families, and ensures that they are a credible source of information. It basically boils down to whether the resident, who is already in a vulnerable situation by living in a facility and relying on the care of others, can feel that they can trust the program to act on their concerns. Because at the end of the day, the Ombudsman program representative gets to go home. The resident is still living in a situation that could be potentially dangerous, and they need to feel secure in how the complaint is handled. For example, if a resident tells a program representative that she's being sexually harassed by a facility maintenance worker, and the representative contacts a state survey agency without the resident's consent to disclose, then the survey team shows up to interview the resident while the maintenance worker is still on site. How would that impact the resident's sense of security and the relationship with the Ombudsman program, who's supposed to be their resident-directed advocate? The program must remain a trusted advocate and resource. Next slide. Thank you. As mentioned earlier, the Ombudsman program provides resident-centered advocacy, is directed by resident goals for complaint resolution, and has strict federal requirements regarding disclosure. Therefore, the Ombudsman role in investigating allegations of abuse is very unique and differs from other entities such as Adult Protective Services and state licensing and certification agencies. This chart compares the Ombudsman program and APS in some core areas. To highlight a few, I just wanted to bring your attention to the fact that the mission of the Ombudsman program to resolve complaints to the satisfaction of the resident and improve quality of care and quality of life, whereas compared to APS, their goal is to stop the abuse, neglect, and exploitation and protect the victim, no matter what that means. The role of individual self-determination for the Ombudsman program means that they are a resident-directed advocate waiting for resident consent to move forward, and it guides their advocacy, whereas APS does stress victim self-determination, but will protect the victim even if it's not consistent with that individual's wishes. Next slide, please. So to quickly recap, and I know I went through a lot of slides and I still have some more with some resources, but the most important parts to walk away with is to remember that the Ombudsman program representatives cannot be mandatory reporters. They provide resident-directed advocacy to resolve issues to the resident's satisfaction. When an Ombudsman program receives any complaint, including those involving abuse, it investigates solely for the purpose of gathering that information to resolve the complaint to the resident's satisfaction. And it does not investigate in order to officially determine whether any law or regulation has been violated, or for the purposes of taking official protective, regulatory, or enforcement action. Next slide. So if you need to contact the Ombudsman program, nursing homes are required to post that information in the facility, but if you want to visit our website, you can also find a map and find your state and local, if they have local programs in your state, that contact information. Next slide. I wanted to provide some state examples of resources. Next slide. This one is from Kentucky. It was a training pulled together in coordination with the Bluegrass Rape Crisis Center and the local Ombudsman program. And that's a great resource. And they also have a companion piece of brochure for consumer education. It's called My Body and My Rights. Next slide. On the NORC website, we also have a web page dedicated just to sexuality and intimacy in long-term care facilities, where of course it's extremely important and facilities must protect residents from abuse, all kinds of abuse. They also need to support the residents' rights to sexuality and intimacy in living in the long-term care facility. So there's a lot of information, policies, procedures, consumer education on that topic on our website. And next slide. The next one. There's a new online training about abuse, neglect, exploitation, and misappropriation of property available on our website. It's a Prezi video with a voiceover, and then we also have a Prezi with a script. So lots of great consumer education information available on that link. And then if you scroll through the next few slides, Alicia, thank you. There's an Ombudsman program reference guide about responding to abuse allegations, as well as a consumer voice and NCEA fact sheet about surveillance cameras in nursing homes, because I also thought that was relevant to this topic. And then of course, we also have information on resident mistreatment. These are those links I promised for information about the nursing home regs. And then a couple of slides about frequently asked questions about the Ombudsman program and their role in investigating abuse allegations. This is on the ACL's website, so I wanted to pull those out as well. So thanks for the time today. Thank you all for being here and listening to this important dialogue. I'm going to turn it back over to Alicia.
Great, thank you, Amity. So I'm going to turn it over to Vicki Elting from the So Vicki, you might have to unmute yourself. We're not hearing you currently on the phone.
Okay. Am I good?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Great.
Hi. Okay. Hi, this is Vicki Elting from the Washington State Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program, and we've had the privilege in the last 3 years of being involved with a collaboration that included actually, the grantee was Disability Rights Washington, and our partners were DRW and WICSAP, which is the Washington Coalition of State Sexual Assault Programs, which is a large organization that encompasses the entire state. The good thing about this collaboration is that we've been able to realize our strengths as 3 different advocacy organizations and realize that we had a lot of capacity to become the experts in technical assistance to advocates who do run into sexual assault or violence in long-term care facilities. Sorry, I have a little frog in my throat. And so in 2015, we began this work, and it was actually a collaboration that first and foremost asked us all to look within our organizations to make sure that we were accessible to and knowledgeable about sexual violence. And that was a long process, and it was a good process. As our first, we've done a lot of projects, so I tried to make this very short. We are the advocates for residents, and who disclose to us that there is some kind of problem in the sexual violence area. What we know that is that there are a lot of people coming in and out of nursing homes who may know about these issues, but we have learned that the average response to the victim is nothing in long-term care, and that was very concerning to us. There is a response in law enforcement and APS, but in terms of support for residents, there hasn't been much response. Next slide. So we also have discovered that sexual violence knows no boundaries. It can affect every age, race, class, culture, gender, ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex. But in the end, we are all affected. Residents of long-term care facilities are highly vulnerable to sexual violence because of their isolation and dependence on others for their care. Residents also, we believe, are largely silent about any sexual violence that that happens to them in long-term care. Next slide. Our biggest realization in the ombudsman programs understand this, but I think it's very important to keep in mind that retaliation for any kind of complaint in a long-term care facility for a resident is considered a big problem. And residents are encouraged in general to not be problems in the organizations that run long-term care facilities. And they may be retaliated against for having or forming relationships with other residents. And I think Amity pointed out that we are not advocates of people not those consented to relationships are allowed and allowed to flourish in long-term care. If you do report as a resident, you are usually perceived as a difficult resident. We've had conversations with staff, and that is usually what comes out, is that this resident who's reporting is definitely a problem in the facility. What retaliation can include are long waits for assistance, not allowing one to leave the facility, restricting visitors, outings, access to resources, events, and activities, and restricting relationships, or showers, over or under medicating, cold food, or food one can't eat. And the most frightening of all retaliations is the threat of discharge. And that's one that we want to pay particular attention to as a barrier to advocacy. Next slide. So what we've learned is that, and Amity pointed this out, it's in the federal law, that we must be survivor or resident driven in our work with this topic. What we do know is that we need to take time and be with the person. Our role is to listen and to be present even without resolution. Advocates are not fixers. Their role is to support and empower. We must ensure confidentiality. Residents often do not complain because they feel that they are not in control of what happens after they complain in a long-term care facility. And that's one of the really important fixtures of the Ombudsman program, and that is we don't ever pursue a complaint on behalf of a resident without their full consent and approval of that plan. Our role also includes questions and mirroring of survivor experience for the support. So talking to a survivor about the experience to the extent that they wish to talk about it. One thing we've also realized is that we need to be more informed on trauma and the trauma that might be the reaction of a person who has been sexually assaulted or has experienced sexual violence. The other thing is that we need to spend time with these people and check back with them and make sure that they're on our radar as we continue to provide services to residents in long-term care. Our next portion of the collaboration is going to look at residents and ombudsmen and advocates being trauma informed. So I'm hoping that this has been helpful. We are just pioneers in this collaboration, and we hope that what it will lead to is more community support for that silence in breaking the silence about sexual violence. So thank you. The project is supported by the Office of Violence Against Women from a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Vicki. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lori to take on the next part of the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Alicia. As we're starting to look at some of the questions that come in, and we'll try to answer a couple of those, I am going to ask Alicia to move through some of the next couple of slides so that we can look at options for getting help for residents and some of the resources that are available beyond what Amity has actually talked about also. So certainly, if you could go back one slide, Alicia, certainly getting help for residents who have been the victim of assault is critical. And it's important, as you heard from Pam earlier, that timeliness of investigation, but also of reporting any suspicions or allegations or concerns about such situations are also critical in having a timely investigation, but also in terms of substantiating what actually has happened and substantiating any crime that may have taken place or any abusive situation that needs addressing in some sort of fashion. And so it's really critical that the allegations be not only reported quickly, but investigated quickly, and that the steps are taken through by the facility and by any investigators, whether they also be law enforcement that are coming in to also take steps to preserve any potential evidence that could need to be preserved in order to help substantiate the complaint. And that includes bedding or clothing or pictures of bruises or anything like that is critically important, because as we hear regularly from ombudsmen and other investigators and family members even, that too often if an allegation has happened too quickly, is it that the resident is showered or the clothes washed or thrown away, or the same thing with the bedding, and it's very difficult to substantiate if you don't have the evidence that's involved. So getting help for investigations as well as for the resident is critical. And then if you can move on to the next slide, Alicia. We talked about how to contact the Ombudsman program. If you need help, also on this page is contact information for Adult Protective Services and other resources that could be helpful if you need some additional assistance in a particular state. And if you'll move on to the next one, Alicia, as well. There are some additional resources, not only on the Ombudsman Resource Center site, but on the Consumer Voice website. As I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast today, we are releasing a brand new issue brief on this topic. It is in your materials in the control panel, and is also going to be posted to our website and will be available for download. But it's an issue brief that includes some good information about sexual abuse, including what some of the signs and symptoms are, what the definitions are, what are things that you can be looking for, not only physical symptoms, but also emotional symptoms or different types of agitation, which could indicate to you that there is a problem or something else has happened that needs some additional support. And as has been mentioned earlier, if a resident has indicated that they have been assaulted or raped, believe them. Your first step should certainly be to believe them and try to get them some support. But the information on the brief also includes some examples of what you can do if you suspect that abuse is occurring in terms of helping to protect the residents. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. On our website, there are issues, an issue page around abuse under the Policy and Advocacy tab, where you can get more resources about this information. And then also, if you move on to the next slide, Alicia, there are some additional information about getting quality care in nursing homes that you can access from the website as well. So next slide, please. And then again, our partners with the National Center on Elder Abuse. And if you go on to the next slide, we'll leave up, while we, I think, have time for just a couple of questions, and we can leave up the slides so people can access the website, and then we'll be able to get some more information. So there are some questions that have come in. Let's try to hit a couple of those before we sign off for today. Some of them are general questions, some are specific to some of the speakers that we have had today. So let's start with, this one was, there were a couple for you, Pam, from the beginning. One was in your data that was shared, there was a high number of unsubstantiated incidences in SNFs. Is there something in the nature of the skilled nursing facility setting or related to the dementia diagnosis that results in more unsubstantiated than in other settings? So I don't know if you want to take a stab at that, and then if anyone else wants to address that, we can as well.
I think it's a good question. I don't know that I have a definitive answer for you on that. I think probably, our data didn't give you definitive, didn't give you a measure of dementia or vulnerability, but I think that there's sort of an issue of vulnerability when a person is in a facility that leaves them open to abuse. But I don't know that I can say. I think it maybe, I don't know if it's the nature of the SNFs themselves or it's the nature of a whole environment there. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether they're any more often reported. I think there are more eyes and ears there, and I've written about that before.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and I mean, certainly there is the problem with people who have been diagnosed with dementia or have some form that people often don't believe those individuals when they express that there has been an issue, and so that may be a factor as well. And I know certainly we have heard plenty of presentations where we see that it is important to make sure that you are following through and believing the individual and doing timely investigation in order to try and find out, did something happen, and maybe what was it, and how what needs to happen to protect the resident and get justice for that person as well. Pam, did you look at any licensing data or in your research, or was it you mentioned Adult Protective Services data was what you were looking at, but do you also look at licensing data?
Yes. We didn't break it out that way because that was sort of an issue that the states that participated wanted. So we didn't do that kind of analysis. So really, we just.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me go down and see. This one, maybe Amity and Vicki, you might be able to take a first stab at this question. This is from an ombudsman who has said that they have a case where there is an alleged resident perpetrator and resident victim, both of whom lack capacity in the same facility. And so the ombudsman is trying to support both residents in this situation. And obviously it's very challenging and it's difficult to do that, particularly as not only does the perpetrator victim need some supports, but also the resident victim needs some supports, and there are families involved on both sides who also are involved. So would either of you like to take a stab at addressing some support for the Ombudsman program in this situation?
Oh, sure, I will. This is Vicki. I think that the critical element in addressing this situation is to find out as much as you can what the resident wants you to do. That to us is the critical element in guiding you in what advocacy steps that you can take and will take. It's often surprising what residents want you to do because it isn't always what we think or what law enforcement or what even APS thinks ought to be happening. So I think that's my nugget here to add.
Great, thanks, Vicki. Sure, I completely agree with what Vicki shared, and just one other suggestion, and this may not be logistically possible, but we have heard of programs with similar situations, and they would partner with another ombudsman within either their program or another neighboring program. If you're just a one-person program, which we know that there are some of those, in order to be able to really focus on the needs of each individual. Not saying that the two ombudsmen should work against each other, but really just to be able to focus on the individual needs of each person that's involved, because those needs, like you said, are very different. And I'm sure that the feedback potentially from the residents and the residents' family may be really different depending on the situation. So just another thing to consider if possible.
Great, thanks, Amity. Another question is, do ombudsmen interact with law enforcement? Do either of you want to touch on that one as well?
Vicki? Sorry, I'm on a webinar. I will. Sorry. I believe that rarely do ombudsmen interact with law enforcement. More, if our role is to report and to make sure that services are being provided for the resident, and that's a big if, because sometimes residents don't want us to be involved in advocating for any of that. It is important that we, work to advocate, continue to advocate for the resident and what they want. So I would say that we more often will interact with APS rather than law enforcement, because APS will sometimes in our state then pass this on to law enforcement. So that's how it goes in Washington.
Thanks, Vicki. Only thing to add is it does work a bit differently across states. So we have seen some ombudsman programs that work more directly with law enforcement, of course, following the guidance and direction of the resident and getting the proper consent. But some other opportunities would be if it would go to actual prosecution. Oftentimes they're victim service providers within law enforcement, and so maybe making that connection between the ombudsman program, the resident, and victim services to advocate and make sure that that resident gets what they need within that system would be one thing to consider and look at. Another opportunity that we've seen some state and local programs take advantage of are some systems advocacy opportunities and educating law enforcement about what elder abuse in general looks like, because they may not know the questions to ask or how to address it and what it looks like. And so some ombudsman programs, they have provided training to law enforcement, or at least participated in part of their training to educate them about what's going in long-term care if they're brought into a case that involves residents. So that's something else to consider as well.
Great points from both of you. A question that I think any of the presenters can jump in on. So if abuse is not substantiated in a particular situation, but a resident is certain that it happened and continues to assert that, what are some things that can be done to offer support or guidance to that person on how to proceed? And it might be for an ombudsman, and it might be for a family member, or for someone else, but what are some things that can be done to support a resident in that situation?
So I guess it's me again. I think this is a very difficult and very challenging position to be in, and luckily our role really defines our response to an allegation not being substantiated, and that is to continue to support and listen and spend time with residents who continue to report the allegation. I think that it's essential that residents have access to trauma-informed counseling and services, and often, because of the reporting requirements, there is no response to residents who have this kind of situation. And so it's really it becomes even more important for the ombudsman to continue to support and talk with the resident.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Thanks, Vicki, because no matter whether it was substantiated or not, that individual still went through something that was traumatic to them. So continuing to support them and make sure they have access to services they need. Absolutely. Thanks, Vicki.
And I would say too, just following up on that, that when we looked at some of the cases ourselves, there were things that we believe really were sexual abuse that hadn't been substantiated. So one of the things that we've written is we think the substantiation rate is for across the cases is lower than it should be, that the evidentiary standard is too low. So, I mean, this is a real blow to the residents and the credibility of him or her. And then we've also seen cases where later on there was another abuse that occurred and they went back to where the resident had made the allegation. In fact, they had been sexually abused. So just because there's not a case of substantiation doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't occur.
Exactly, and that's a great point, Pam. And what we know across the board is that complaints and different types of allegations, the substantiation rates of those are minimal anyway. And when you get into abuse situations and then even more narrowly sexual abuse situations, the numbers of substantiation are nowhere near, we think, what they probably should be. So I think that's why the timeliness of reporting and investigation, making sure that you are taking the allegation seriously, or if the resident is exhibiting signs or showing that something is wrong, taking that very seriously and following up on it is really critical. Knowing the symptoms, knowing the indicators. So I think we're at the end of our time for today. So we're going to close out. I'd like to really thank all of our presenters today, Dr. Pam Teester, Amity Overall-Labe, Alicia Lineswala, and Vicki Elting. Thank you for your presentations. And Julie Shane, thanks to you and the National Center on Elder Abuse for supporting this work and partnering with us on this work today. It's really critical. As a reminder, the slides from today and the issue brief can be downloaded from your control panel, but they will also be posted to the Consumer Voices website along with a copy of the recording so that you can download it for future use. And we really encourage you to be working with your facilities on implementing appropriate policies and procedures. Those of you that can be asking questions about them and asking about what are the procedures, should there be concerns in this area, how are staff being trained, participate in that and make connections with training programs, and participate in elder abuse task forces that may be existing in your state or communities. They exist all over the country, and they're important resources for making connections, for training, and for resources in the sense of protecting residents. So thank you so much for being with us today, and have a good rest of the afternoon.